Hello, beautiful community. Let me know if you can hear me. Let me know if you can hear me. Gonna have a lovely small Q&A in the middle of the night. If my theory works well, then I'll have a more impressive answer rate if we're a smaller group, so that could be good. Hello, everybody. Just give me a thumbs up or something like that if you can hear me. There's a kind of a magical mute button on my mic, which I press by accident. Brilliant. Thank you so much. Fantastic. Fantastic. Let's jump in. Because I want to, as I always do, I really, want to honor the folks who dropped questions patiently. A little before we started. So let's see what we've got there. I'm going to. So if your question is terribly important, wait about 5 minutes before you drop it, because I'm probably going to miss the questions the next 5-10 minutes, because I'm going to answer the ones that are toward the top first. Let's go. Rachel. Good night, good morning, good evening. Advice on talking with friends who are 100% convinced that every move, every misstep Trump makes is under the instruction of the Kremlin. Well, I am somebody who doesn't like abstract questions, and that means that it depends on you and on the friend and on your relationship with politics and on theirs. And there's a big range here from saying, oh, how interesting, I wonder why you think that, to saying, shut up and listen and don't speak again because you know nothing about what you're talking about. Now, something has to feel natural in between that range. There is a feature that people who think that the Kremlin controls Trump share with Putin sympathizers in the West, and that means non-Russian Putin sympathizers in the West, and that is they don't know anything about Putin and the Putin regime, really. And they're not actually sympathizing with Putin. They're just taking an anti-American position or an anti-institutional position. They're saying that the system, the establishment is broken in the West. And that's actually a deeply powerful point, which you can't easily dismiss. And the same goes with those folks who think that Trump's controlled by the Kremlin. In virtually all cases, they couldn't give even an elementary account of Putin or the Russian state or how the Kremlin has evolved over the last few years. So, depending on your relationship, you could call bullshit on them because the odds are they just don't know anything about Russia. And can you judge whether Trump is controlled in a significant way by Russia unless you know quite a bit about Russia? No, you can't. And that basic picture is missing, just like it's missing for the people who say, well, Putin is not so bad. Well, try to make a couple of YouTube videos and then receive an axe through the door at 5 a.m. and then see how that's not so bad. So that's one approach, to talk about Russia a little bit more and to explore how the Russian regime works. It's very important to acknowledge the reality of Russian interference and to acknowledge its aspirations, which is to destabilize our democracies. That's all real. And to toxicify and exacerbate the conflicts we already have with one another. And most interestingly, I think it is a kind of aim of Russian interference in our politics that our worry about the interference becomes more damaging than the interference itself. So here an interesting thought follows. These people have a functional relationship with the way the Kremlin is trying to damage our democracies. Because what the Kremlin wants is hysteria about Trump being controlled. And that hysteria leads to externalization of issues that are mostly to do with domestic political decay, domestic political difficulties. I'm very conscious of using the word hysteria for different reasons. Firstly, because I do think that there's a deep psychoanalytic story to be told about it. Secondly, because it's a terribly anti-feminist word, because um, there's a huge history, and that stuff still going on, of women with serious health conditions being dismissed as though they were suffering from anxiety, which they're not, because of the way that concept has percolated in the 20th century through the Western medical system. So I've just used that word in a rather casual way, and I hope that's okay. So, why does getting this right matter, though? I think it matters because you want citizens who are awake to what's really going on in our democracies. And we're terribly asleep about that. We're terribly asleep about um, very problematic patterns going on in our democracies. And we're terribly asleep about even more problematic counter patterns to the problematic patterns, right? Somebody who is one of the best experts in the world actually on Russia just tweeted yesterday, "Oh, I don't see any problem with hyper identity politics." That's a terrifying predicament, because not only does somebody like that not recognize that that's a problem, they're also then not going to see that there's an enormous um, authoritarian, um, anti-democratic, counter-revolutionary wave coming and already building against so-called leftist identity politics. It's not really leftist at all. And so we've got something we should worry about, and then something counteracting it that we should worry about even more. Right? And you miss both. So just that alertness to what is actually going on in our democracies is absolutely essential to us being constructive citizens. I've gone on for a long time, but still only 10% of the answer. Kirill has said something lovely, I think, about my content, and I'm going to get to you in a second. Now let's speed up. Tony, I'm going to take one of your questions, but I hope to get to other questions you want to ask about 20th century um, political literature too. But for now, you're saying, why would anyone think that Charles Taylor and Alistair McIntyre are more relevant or significant philosophers than Noam Chomsky or Cornel West or Robert Paul Wolff? Recognition, language games go nowhere. Now, I'm going to be gentle. I might not have been gentle on you in another mood. I'm going to be gentle on you. The two most important works by Charles Taylor, who is as great a public intellectual as anybody in the Western world, but he's also beyond that an even more important intellectual than he is a public intellectual. Two most important works are Sources of the Self, 1989, and A Secular Age, which is a very big, important book, one of the two most important books of social philosophy of the 21st century, which he published in 2004. With Alistair McIntyre, it's difficult to pick out his best books quite so easily. What I would say is that paradoxically, even though McIntyre rarely appears in public, he is actually psychologically more of a public intellectual than he's given credit for. And that means it's an important stylistic point about how we should understand him. Enough for the moment. Philippe, Vlad, you said Westerners can't properly interpret what they hear on 1420 street interviews. What exactly do we lack? 1420 shows incisive regime critical statements to the Russians, the second question, yet Putin's repression enforcers have yet to take 1420 off the air. It would be different if 1420 were broadcasting anti-Putin stuff, which they're not. Many answers, so let me try to be brief. Sometimes, when very few people agree to answer that question, a question you ask, right, as a, I don't know, social anthropologist or just as a pollster, that's okay, as long as the tiny percentage that remains is representative. What is important to understand about Russia isn't just that the number of people who agree to answer the questions is really small. It's that that small percentage is not a good representation. That when a small number of people in a tyrannical regime agree to answer questions in public, they are not going to be representative of the rest of the population. So you obviously can't see what you see on the screen as a remotely representative sample of what's going on in Russian society. Um, I do think that it entails some risk to go on screen and say, I don't like Putin. A couple of people have got into legal trouble in Russia for doing answering a vox pop question on the street, and they were found. I think it was for Deutsche Welle that they did a little vox pop Q&A and they got caught. So the risks involved, and the risks mean that we're going to get a very distorted sample of people. Above that, the nature of the depoliticization in Russia is very special. And so what often happens is when somebody says they support the war, once you dig below, you recognize they don't really. They just support whatever Putin does, which is invading Ukraine and giving $10 billion of aid to Ukraine and apologizing for confiscating Crimea. They support both. Um, so that's very important. This outsourcing of power to the Kremlin is not the same thing as supporting the war. And then there are very special relationships I won't go into right this minute that people have with the very idea of doing a poll in Russia. And these are going to be different to what we've got in the West. Unless you know a lot about this, you're not really going to understand what you're seeing. And therefore, is it true that most people who watch 1420 don't understand what they're seeing? Yes, it is. Trash0815, you think technocratic leaders in Western democracies are depoliticizing? I think that there is a certain kind of model of politician, which is a low quality politician we would have had 10, 20 years ago, who is a political entrepreneur, who is surfing the waves of public opinion in an entrepreneurial way. And these people often actually aren't explicitly bad in the ways we most worry about. So they might not be, let us say, post-truth populists, but they succumb to some of these bad patterns, even without being conscious about them, without trying to express them or exploit these patterns, simply in virtue of their entrepreneurial approach. That's a tiny fragment of the answer, but that's about it for the moment, if that's okay. But we'll come back to this. Alex with letters: are EU countries taking defense spending more seriously now? Yes, they are. Or is it as lackluster as it was before? It's not. It's different, but everything is up in the air in terms of where we're going to be months from now with how the Western world sees this conflict. And as I tried to argue on the main channel a couple of days ago, what happens with the counteroffensive will decide quite a lot, actually. So even our strategy at the level of military spending is going to be a bit dependent on what happens on the battlefield. But the answer is yes, it is going to be taken more seriously, but not seriously enough to allay criticisms which point out how much United States is basically covering Europe's bum. AKH, I'd like you to expand on what you said in an earlier live stream about encouraging thinking about Ukrainian conscription through the lens of necessity rather than morality. My basic position about forced conscription in Ukraine is that it would be wrong to see it as a tyrannical policy because any state in Ukraine's circumstances would be forced to do it that way. So to critique it, you would need to envisage an alternate reality in which such policies weren't necessary, and you can't do that, it seems to me. Misha, question about Z radicals. Has this progressed into something beyond what we saw at the beginning of the war? Could it have formed without the war? No, it couldn't have. And yes, it has progressed far beyond what we saw at the beginning of the war. I think that it's going to keep on progressing. And the more Putin fails to hold against Ukraine's counteroffensive, the more he's going to need to carefully manage this partly theatrical, but partly actually genuinely real opposition to him, which, as some commentators call, is the party of victory. If Putin is the party of war, this is the party of victory that says that we are pro-war, but Mr. Putin is too pathetic to give us a victory in this war, so we need something different. Let us have a look. And I saw you somewhere. Let's have a look. Yeah. And first of all, you should be asleep. What's the best way of encouraging friends I agree with on a political issue where they feel personally threatened by the opposite side, not to hate the people on the other side? Should they even do that? Yeah. I mean, look, there are a lot of very decent people who vote for very destructive political candidates. It doesn't stop these people being decent. There's a lot that I could say. Let me just say one thing that kind of connects to that depoliticization conversation we have about what's going on with that blob in the middle in Russia. When somebody is a victim, falls for an obvious and harmful falsehood, it's tempting to think that the problem is that they don't get the truth. The problem is that they are ignorant or irrational. But much more likely, the answer is going to be that they're not ignorant of the truth, they're resisting it. Because acknowledging that truth could be a threat to their political agency. That is why these debates are so intractable over culture war issues, right? They are not intellectual debates. They're just not. Let me just provoke some of you a little bit. You might get triggered by that, but the reality is that that's life. Very few people, in my opinion, think that masks, face masks, don't work. It's almost always a position that's arrived at via a certain idea of how one's participating in the political life of one's culture, right? So let me say this to soften it up in case you have some issue with masks. Just assume that that could be a different example. But if I tell you something about the efficacy of masks, that says that, um, in fact, the efficacy is non-existent against, all kinds of pathogens and even against pollution. Um, Admitting that I'm wrong isn't just admitting that I'm wrong. It's what the wonderful young Russian political philosopher called the other day when he was talking about the Russian depoliticized blob in the middle. He called it committing political suicide. When you're asking, for example, a Trump voter that you believes some um, dangerous truths to give them up, you're not asking them to reflect better on what they think. You're asking them potentially to do something that they would experience as suffocating themselves politically, suffocating their political agency. Um, and so there's a kind of oppressive element here to a truthful picture of reality. Um, in Russia, it's the same and much more extreme. The depoliticized blob are not ignorant. They are resisting truths. Because if they admit those truths, it would give an account of their political agency that would be so catastrophic and so impoverished that it would be a kind of unlivable political experience. Um, so I think we've got to be very, very serious and not treat these debates as intellectual disagreements where somebody needs to consider a scientific paper they haven't read or something else. We've got to be very, very serious and not underestimate the psychological sophistication of the entrenchment on the other side against you. Um, just because something looks intellectually unsophisticated doesn't mean it's unsophisticated all the way through, right? So we've got to understand that we're often asking people to give up things, um, which would leave them feeling completely emaciated, right? Because they have beliefs that are predicated on seriously putting into questions institutions which they feel don't work for them, which they feel leave them powerless, which they feel threaten them, which they feel deprioritize them, right? That is very often what you're asking people to do when you're saying, oh, admit this thing about public health policy, oh, admit that thing about, um, I don't know, redistributive taxation, um, admit this other thing about, firearms. So um, we've got to really reckon with the fact that political disagreement is an intellectual disagreement, and we've got to be very serious about that full density of psychosocial context behind the view that yes, in a philosophy seminar you could conceivably dismiss as poorly thought through or silly. Franklin, I don't have much to say, I'm afraid, about your question. I think you're asking a question about things that we don't know about, really. Um, I'm afraid. Um, but I, really appreciate your participation. And if you wanted to ask another question and drop it in the comments, maybe even at the end of this video, if you put it in bold that I promised to answer, I'll answer another one from you if you want. RSH 696, to my friends and family, politicize is a dirty word. Yeah, it is. I felt the same before finding your videos. I think this is from confusing politicize and polarize. How do you politicize without polarizing? In low trust societies with a low solidarity, like the United States, It's very difficult to politicize without polarizing. So, for example, it's inevitable that the bigger Ukraine becomes as an issue in US politics, the more polarizing it becomes. The bigger the issue becomes, whether it's a good thing to drink electrolytes, the more polarizing it becomes. I mean, there really will be people who think that, there's something ghastly about electrolytes. So the real contrast with politicization is not unity or solidarity. It's actually what I would call expressive politics, which is a non-political way of doing politics. So an example that's very common, look at Mr. Navalny, the Russian opposition leader. Here are 100 things he has said. 4 of them are really rude or disrespectful or have the reverberation of colonial ambitions. That means that Mr. Navalny is not a good thing and we should just stop talking about him, right? That's expressive politics. It's politics without any politics in it. Political politics is to politicize the issue of Navalny. Let's say if you're Ukrainian, is Russia has an opposition leader who is in jail. We're Ukraine. Can we use him? Is it to our advantage if Mr. Navalny gains more leverage in Russia, in or out of jail? If it is, let's use this. If it isn't, let's be clear that it isn't and then move on to something else. That's politics. Because politics has always an ethical component to it, right? Otherwise, we'd say that some terrible dictators who were very effective at being terrible dictators were the best politicians ever. Politics has an ethical component, but ethics is only one component of political action. If ethics becomes the only component of political action, politics dies. And in fact, if you try to do politics by making it applied ethics, you lose. Like you literally lose. You lose elections, you lose conflicts, you lose debates. So, let me give you another very simple example. Let's say I don't like the policies of a certain state, right? Let's say I am critical of Israel's policies, right? And then I ask myself a question. Should I stop buying Israeli oranges? An expressive position would say, well, hang on. Yeah, I don't like this country's policies. I'm not going to have their oranges. Right? An effective, right? A politically political approach would say, okay, I'll stop buying oranges if me not buying oranges will have a 0.00000, etc., 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 0.1 practical impact on the ground and might perhaps help people that are being victimized in some dynamic like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict I might be worried about, right? So expressive versus effective. The contrast with politicize is always expressive action. Some of that we've seen with the Egyptian shark attack and the reaction online. I've been asked to comment on that. I might end up reluctantly doing a separate video on this. Misha, is the popularity of Z radicalism in Serbia unique to Serbian history with Russia? A bit. Or is there a potential for Z to become grassroots in other European nations without these cultural commonalities? Unfortunately, there is a bit, yeah. But this won't be actual support for Putin. This will be Putin used as a vehicle to express opposition to domestic institutions, to the domestic establishment. That, in a way, goes back to our reaction to Rachel's question, where we were talking about using Russia, but effectively just doing domestic politics with Russia as a kind of um, a rather poorly filled out prop that one uses along the way, right? Most discourse on Russia before the war was prop discourse, um, which had little to do with Russia and everything to do with our domestic way of seeing the world. And of course, a lot of war commentary right now still remains very American-centric, right? And that era reproduces in very different kinds of perspectives and mistakes. Even John Mearsheimer's perspective is rather American-centric in a way. Um, at least American-centric in its popularity, right? Because following Mearsheimer allows you to think about this whole conflict in terms of things the US did or didn't do, right? You're talking about your own favorite or unfavorite toy, rather than the other toy next door. But I would say that as distrust grows in institutions, um, grassroots sympathy for Putinism will grow. Daniel, um, wish you good health. Thank you so much. I'm wondering why Putin doesn't see China as a bigger threat than China. You mean America? And if the West can awaken Russia to a Chinese threat as an effective strategy, this Russia can't be awakened to anything. It's all in. This regime will go all in its attempts to destroy Ukraine and escalate against NATO if it has that capacity. That's all this regime is going to do unless it collapses. So they're all in, and they're seeing being in a very exposed and secondary and then lovely dynamic with China as an inevitable price of this. So that's probably a much more interesting question if we apply it to what comes after Putin. And one of the fascinating things will be how far could a post-Putin regime in Moscow extract itself out of these rails of subservience to China that would have been put in place by Putinism. And the answer might be very unlovely there in terms of anybody who wanted Russia to um, separate away from China. In terms of the cultural impulse, Russia overwhelmingly looks more to the West than to China. Once you get rid of the kind of regime that you've got in Russia, the preponderance will be to look to the West, not to China, in cultural terms, right? I mean, for every Russian who would want to linguistically and culturally immerse themselves in China, there's going to be 20 who would want to immerse themselves in English in the United States and so on. Calm like a bomb. Vlad, is it possible to convince the West in committing to Ukrainian victory completely? And if yes, what is necessary to convince them and what will change the consequences? Thank you. I think the answer is no, except Putin using nuclear weapons, actually. But you could, this is a matter of degree, right? So what would have happened if some of the weapons Ukraine got more of and earlier, for example, right? So there are always degrees. And I would say that central to understanding this as an argument that has weight, this argument that the West should be committed to Ukrainian victory or more committed to Ukrainian victory, is the understanding of what project it is we're dealing with in the Kremlin. If you think that the Kremlin just wants Ukraine or a bit of Ukraine and that's really it, that's different to Putin's wider aspirations toward Eastern Europe to Putin's aspirations to challenge NATO? In other words, do you think that Putin poses as a direct threat? Or do you think that Putin poses as an indirect threat via his aggressive and imperialist ambitions in Ukraine? Right. So I think giving an account of the kind of um, model of escalation we've got in the Kremlin, giving an account of why it's a push or smash model. In other words, it'll just smash itself or keep pushing. There's nothing else. Why is that so, right? Is it really so? I mean, I say that it's so in much of my commentary, but that's something that needs to be interrogated always and discussed, right? And when I insist on that as my interpretation of what's going on in the Kremlin, it's very important that I welcome um, conversation about this. It can't just be drilled in. Um, so I think that the most compelling argument for standing by Ukraine stronger is not the ethical argument. It's not the humanitarian argument. It's not a values-based argument. It's um, an argument that actually takes seriously some of these bizarre threats coming at us from the Russian propaganda TV that threat directly at us, like we're going to sink, your country with some kind of wave. That's what they say about the UK. Now, we've got to realize that that is not obviously what they think in the Kremlin, but it's not completely discontinuous with some of their aspirations, right? So um, that story about escalation, I think, is central to how we answer your question. But can we persuade the West that a comprehensive victory for Ukraine is so necessary that we should simply make it inevitable without Putin using nuclear weapons or something like that? It seems to me that's not on the cards. Franklin, um, you've got another question. So kind of you. Why do people find the NATO expansion theory so convincing, even though NATO only added 2 members in the decade prior to Finland joining? Um, so I do think that the NATO expansion story is a disaster, and I do think that it's played a part in the uh, escalatory Kremlin that we've got. Um, Now, it's a very complex conversation, what could have been done instead. And so the alternatives would be a much more rapid expansion of NATO or no expansion of NATO, right? Um, but whatever your views are, saying something like, oh, here are a couple of countries we may welcome into NATO in the future, but we can't do it now. That's the worst of all worlds, really. So NATO expansion was handled for complex reasons, obviously with domestic policy. It's a complex world. Was handled very badly, and it means that we have a role in the situation that we've witnessed recently, in bringing it about. Now, what I like to say about Putin's war is it's more against NATO than it is against NATO expansion, because Putin is engaged in a large scale escalation that he can't realize now but hopes to realize later against NATO, and not just against an excess of NATO expansion that he wants to bring under control while feeling okay about all the other NATO countries. I think that at the biographical level, Putin is very triggered by NATO expansion. I mean, it is genuinely an issue for him. So those people who have sometimes heard come close to saying that he makes it up, he fakes this concern, they're wrong. But Putin's deep anxiety about NATO expansion isn't the central cause of this war. No? And if you were to explain the causes of this war in relation to NATO, you would say this sort of shorthand that I've just put on the table, this war is more against NATO than it is against NATO expansion. But this is a huge question, and we might talk about it a bit more in the future. Um, I am potentially at risk of missing some of your questions. Let's have a look. There we go. You may have answered this in the past. Johnny is asking, but what's your guess to how this war ends and with a possible timeline to end? Thank you, Johnny. Look, um, the quicker the better. But a bad outcome is only a coin toss away. An outcome where this war goes on for quite a long time. It's possible in two ways that this thing could go on for a long time. That means years. But it's also possible that this stops and then another second Ukrainian war begins in the late 2020s, for example. And Ukraine needs to be prepared for that. What makes pessimism an important part of our pie chart of possibilities is that military experts are not predicting that Ukraine will expose and take Crimea. They are considering that that would be an overachievement. I can't get into that, but what I can get into is the political story. And the political story is that Putin isn't going to stop unless he runs out of capacity or loses power. And therefore, if he keeps power, that's what I say in the main channel video, after losing Crimea, and that would be a resplendent magisterial overachievement by Ukraine. But if Putin loses Crimea to Ukraine and doesn't start a nuclear war in the process, he's just going to continue lobbing stuff into Ukrainian territory to make sure that Ukraine can't rebuild, hoping that if he lobs stuff in, that Ukraine can't join NATO. So the scenarios, according to which this ends well and soon for Ukraine, are the unlikely scenarios. So that's the reality we're looking at. But they are plausible, they're possible, and some of what we've said already today implies that it's still a bit up to us how likely each of the outcomes is. But yeah, I mean, we're certainly not sitting here with the possibility to say that the war is likely to end in a few months. We're not in this position. Chris, if a political vacuum occurs in Russia, such as Putin's downfall, to what extent might Russians and future Russian leaders look to Ukraine as a successful example of how to run their society? Well, this implies a flourishing post-war Ukraine, and that Ukraine itself will face huge obstacles, and its democratic credentials are not secure. But the answer is yes, of course, and that's one of Putin's greatest fears. And that is why the existence of Ukraine is a bit existential for him, because he fears that if and when his regime becomes wobbly, the last thing he wants is a democratic and independent Ukraine, even if that Ukraine is not a member of any Western alliances. It's a direct threat. It's like a sort of a very dangerous um, you know, platform adjacent to his empire that models and inspires an outcome whereby Russians get rid of him and have something that they can just see right next door to them. So um, Putin thinks that that's a threat. Um, Now, Ukrainians are not going to be friendly toward Russians for a very long time, let's say 2 generations, even if Russia turns about. We shouldn't overstate that, um, because the interpenetration between Russia and Ukraine is very deep. It's got very toxic, and many families are horrendously split over this now. But as much as there's an anti-colonial movement in Ukraine that's powerful, and as much as Ukrainians feel violent rage toward Russians, the interpenetration is great. So we need to not trust Twitter, right? On this, it's not going to give us quite an accurate picture. Um, so yeah, I think that an independent democratic Ukraine is an existential threat to Putin in his mind, and quite frankly, I actually think in reality too. John, thank you. Indy from California, thank you for the helpful wishes. I'm curious if you know of any moment during Putin's tenure as a leader when he was genuinely seeking closer ties with the West. Yeah, it wasn't quite natural for him, but yeah. Um, the first term was quite continuous with some of Yeltsin's policies, and Putin only recently had um, an outburst about how he asked Clinton if Russia could join NATO and felt terribly rejected by that. So um, Putin had a lot of positive um, ideas about cooperating with the West, but not all of them were very natural for him. In many ways, the first few years of his presidency are kind of unnatural years. It's not Putin being Putin. He didn't develop his bizarre sense of mission yet, which came in the 2010s. He was much more a pragmatic politician. And he also had a bit of a man crush on George W. Bush. He thought Bush was a solid guy with whom he could deal. Later, he felt terribly betrayed by Bush. So, sure, Putin had some aspirations, but I would argue that the time to positively impact Russia's trajectory would have been the 1990s. That's really the time of the missed opportunity, not early Putinism. Misha, it's great to have you. Dmitry is asking me about have I followed the recent opposition summit in Brussels. Yeah, Rachel, I looked into his soul. Yeah, I have. A lot of more work needs to be done by the Russian opposition to make the West feel that they can turn to the Russian opposition and say, tell us what's up on the core issues in a way that's not conflict ridden. So don't tell us 7 incompatible things, please. Can you agree on 7 big points, right? That we can say, okay, this is where the Russian opposition stands. And then can you give us some indication of your legitimacy? who do you represent? Even if that's aspirational, we want um, to know. So that's these sorts of events are helpful from that point of view. Equally, the Russian opposition needs to feel um, the Russian opposition needs to feel that Russian people need to feel that the Russian opposition also represents them, the Russians who are against the war. So they need to build up their legitimacy and really give the perception of a plural, healthily conflictive bloc that nevertheless agrees on some core questions of policy and procedure. So, um, and there is progress with it. I mean, if you turn to the Russian opposition now, they're all saying Crimea is Ukrainian. They're all saying Russia should be a parliamentary democracy. They're all saying two or three other things. It's not enough. We need more, but these are small steps in the right direction. Um, but I have a video on my main channel about the uh, depoliticized nature of Russia's political opposition in a way. It's a video about Russian imperialism, where I say that the story that Russia needs to be a civilized country just like the West is a vacant political story. And it's an evasion of politics to keep running with it and regurgitating it, actually. And that's a big problem the Russian opposition still needs to overcome. Yeah. Mm. Vanessa, I'm happy to answer something from the Russian point of view about this. There's about 7 or 4 countries in the world about whose domestic politics I'm very comfortable talking about. So I want to be conservative here, and I might elide your question politely, but DM me if you want to put it in a different way. Um, what um, the Russians are always trying to do is maximize division among countries who may not be quite on their side and minimize their political and their economic isolation. And, you know, what we're going to see going forward as Western sanctions deepen is we're going to see Russia-friendly countries coming to Russia and saying, these things we were doing for you and with you, we can't do them anymore because we'll be in trouble. So we can still help you, but there's going to be a more circuitous way of doing. There's a more circuitous route. And these are the kind of conversations that are globally happening now that Russia is globally engaged in. But that's all I want to say for the moment. But I do welcome a DM from you to ask something different or this in a different way. Thinkla is asking, how did you view the US as very conservative? I think that the progressive politics in the US is very progressive. In fact, it's become so progressive, it's become regressive in many ways, and depoliticized and divisive. But nevertheless, if it were possible to take away the crisis of depoliticizing identity politics, you could say that there's a certainly a significant demographic that is more progressive than any group that's ever lived. But that's compatible with an increase in cultural conservative sentiment, and that increase will continue, and that increase will persist much longer than the identity politics. So that identity politics story will dry up by the 2030s, in my assessment, but the cultural conservatism will go up. There's going to be, to some degree, a restructuring of left and right political parties. Left political parties in the West, in the United States, I don't think you can call the Democratic Party left, really. They're a kind of blend of centrism, center right, center left stuff. But so-called left parties will go more culturally conservative, which sounds absolutely shocking to people at the moment, but that's what will happen, in my view. And right parties will go a bit more progressive on economic policy. So that's a trend worth noting. More pie, thank you. Yeah, that's a fascinating trend. I regard it as nearly inevitable that we're going to have a shift in that direction to some extent. We're going to have to see how big it is, but I do see um, some of the right in a populist way moving toward more redistributive policies, and I do see some of the left moving in a more culturally conservative way. That might not mean all of the left. It might mean more conflict within the left between people who become more and more culturally anti-conservative and people who become more culturally conservative. There is not much cultural conservatism in, let us say, the Labour Party in the UK, but that's going to change. Knoxville is asking, does Putin value more his cultural legacy or regime security? The same thing, I think. That's the same thing to him. Um, uh, he despises people who lose regimes and lose empires. He despises Nicholas II and Gorbachev a lot. Rachel, we need to talk about that. I don't think that's necessarily correct, that British liberal feminists are rabid. And that may be a misunderstanding of identity politics. What needs to be put front and center, that actually very few people are doing because of the toxicity of the debate, is that there may be a conflict of rights involved. Um, and we're looking at discourses there that are in conflict, that do not allow the possibility of a conflict of rights. They say my rights are human rights, and when we think of human rights, we tend to think of rights that have a simple priority, right? We'll be talking much more about this. Yeah, Rachel, we'll be talking more about this. It's a story I follow very closely, actually. I follow conflicts of rights stories very closely. Yeah, we'll be talking more about it. It's it's very rare to find a conversation that is sensible here, um, and does not, um, on the one hand, diminish a group's experience of, um, their identity in a core way, not identity they've chosen, but identity that just is who they are, right? But at the same time um, respects conflicts of rights. There's a very important conversation here that's missing properly from the public eye about what's happening behind closed doors with these discourses in universities, in political parties as well. So we'll go there. Um, Holy moly! Could the shark attack be God subtly supporting Ukraine? Let me say a tiny bit. A few people have asked me to comment. I don't want to comment on this. Um, so, Mr. We're going to stop talking about trans rights right now, because this needs so much context and respect and honoring of people's experience to even frame this conversation. So I recommend everybody stops talking about it. I'm not gonna be impressed if that conversation keeps going. Sorry to say, um, but not because I want to obstruct it, but because I want to have it in a very proper and rich way. Otherwise, we just start regurgitating the same stuff back and forth divisively. Now, there have been two things that have happened, that even some Ukrainian folks have come out and said, no, it's enough. I don't want to take a strong position on this, um, but what happened was an absolutely ghastly shark attack in the Red Sea, with a Russian man being taken by a tiger shark, 24-year-old Russian man. This is pretty much on camera, and there's been some jubilation about this online. And the second thing that's happened is that a lot of people, including many establishment Western journalists, saying, um, um, "Oh, nothing is so definite. We can't be sure about whether the shark did this or not, or we haven't heard the shark's perspective. It's premature to jump to conclusions. But who's to blame?" So all of that kind of stuff exploded and went viral. So both sort of taking the shark's side in this man's tragic demise, and also making this joke about not everything is so definite, the Russian propaganda story. Um, I'm not going to be po-faced about this, so I'm not going to want to ban all of that stuff. But my instinct is no, that's not amazing to go there in big to go for the internet to go there in big numbers is not good, and it's not a pretty sight for Ukraine's the perception of Ukraine globally for that to be so widely viral. These kinds of reactions. Um, yeah, somebody I knew. Um, in I think early 2006 was killed by a tiger shark in the South Pacific. Um, so I know what that's like, right? Um, I stood next to a young woman's body who was killed by a shark just an hour earlier. Um, so we don't. But I mean, I'm not gonna ban jokes in Vlad world. But we, we, you get it. Aristovich came out and said, "Guys, we've got to stop this. This is getting out of hand." The mockery of the Russian man who lost his life. Rory, love back. Actually, the person I knew who was killed was also the same age as that guy, the 24-year-old um, woman, very young woman. Um, yeah, 20 years ago, pretty much. Merrily, no worries, you're late. Um, we're kind of chilling. We've gone off course a little bit a few times. Let's try to see how we can get back on. Guy in Seattle is saying, "Keep talking. It's difficult to shut me up." So I'm very grateful to you. Oh, Alex, I really want to have a separate conversation with this. Um, you're saying that trans lives will get harder. Uh, I feel like you're saying that the trans lives will get harder is because of economic decline in the West. No, I don't think trans lives will get harder. I think they'll get easier, but there is going to be, and is already happening, a very big counter-revolutionary wave that's coming, from which an authoritarian counter-revolutionary wave coming against wokeism in the way it describes itself, but it's actually not coming against wokeism, it's coming against democracy, right? But that doesn't mean wokeism isn't real. So you've got to keep two thoughts in mind at the same time. That's the direction of the threat to trans people, not Kathleen Stock. Okay, in the big picture, right? I'm going to take that very, very seriously. And what we need to do, if you want to ask me about this, is yeah, we can have a conversation about um, the place of trans rights over 10, 20 years in Western countries, and how we get the best outcome. How we get the best outcome that way. So I'm critical of trans discourse in some significant aspects, very critical. But I am extremely critical of the anti-trans discourse too. For me, trans people are real. They have rights. And there are some things like that I'm not interested in negotiating on. But what then happens is, could trans rights conflict with the rights of other groups in societies? And how does this balance, right? And that's the conversation we need to have in a serious and mature way. I've already gone beyond where I wish to be, simply because you need a huge amount of context here. I mean, a huge amount of context. I mean, you need a story about identity politics and culture wars. You need a story about how, for political purposes, is being trans different to being gay, for example, right? Um, is it the same? Is it different? What's so many important things need to be placed on the table. You can't even begin this conversation, and a lot of people have very distorted views even about the shape of a conversation like that. Um, so yeah, so I do not myself have very many culturally conservative views in the old sense of cultural conservatism. And I'm a big fan of identity politics, actually, but not when it goes wrong. Eugene. So as we turn more toward talking about the West, we will get to these sorts of conversations a bit too. But primarily, we'll be talking about democratic regeneration, but and degeneration. But we'll get to these conversations too. Eugene, do you blame regular Russians for not protesting? Mm, no, I mean, I don't operate in these categories partly because I'm not a Russian citizen. I could blaming Brits for not doing something, but I'm not a citizen of that country. I don't feel in any kind of political unity with Russians. Um, on the chat channel, 0.5% of our viewers are Russian, and on the main channel is about 1%. So that's, you know, it's not my audience. Um, so I think that the the single short bit of advice here, if I were being asked for advice, Misha, exactly, everybody defines identity politics differently. You need an account of what the phenomena is in its ideal and in its deformed form. So we'll get there. Um, my advice is that Russians who are open to protesting should consider using their energies effectively. And that may mean timing. What you don't want to do is create a situation where the Putin regime cracks and protest really makes a difference, but by that time, everybody's in jail who may have protested. There's a very interesting balance. And then I just make a sort of a trivial comment. Um, with the kinds of pressure that the state puts on any protest enterprise in Russia, yeah, very few people would protest. So it's not a cultural issue. I mean, you just if you're threatened with 15 years in jail and your family's bank accounts being frozen, um, the only way you're going to protest is if you think it's really going to make a difference. And for that, you need more of a crack in the Putin regime that is happening now, right? So if Putin gives some kind of order and the military doesn't carry it out, then you can go out en masse and protest and even risk your life, because that might be a situation where there's a genuine possibility of a positive outcome. Yeah, we're not talking about peaceful protests to bring a message to Mr. Putin. We're talking about protests that are so big that Putin will get the impression that he's about to lose his monopoly of organized violence. I can't answer a question about Japan's depoliticization in all honesty. Let's see, let's see. Yeah, human on Earth. What do I mean by imperial self-immolation? Um, I mean that the regime is now set on a kind of path of escalation, and that path can't be reversed. I don't think it's possible for Putin to just dust himself off and say, I've had enough. That's it. The society will be being militarized little by little, and Putin will be trying to get himself to a place where he's more prepped to do something that he feels he doesn't have the capacity to do now. I don't think that can change unless the regime collapses. Beyond that, can the Putin regime succeed? No, it can't, because it has nothing to offer. Because even if some magical world, it reconstituted itself to some extent militarily, invaded Ukraine in 2030 with greater success, provoked Article 5 by invading a Baltic state, exposed Article 5 with NATO not acting on it, right? If all of these things went in Putin's favor, he would still fail because nobody wants his stuff. People don't want the crap he's offering because he's not offering anything except violence and destruction. That's why you can't find people in Eastern Europe who are going to be delighted to say, okay, let's welcome Mr. Putin's umbrella coming atop our heads again, reformatting us into some kind of Warsaw Pact Part 2. Nobody wants that. And he doesn't have anything to offer people in Eastern Europe. And that's why it's going to be a fleeting success, with the only question being, how much does Putin destroy along the way to crashing into a wall, as inevitably he will with his project? It's a little bit more on this imperial self-immolation. Okay. Okay. Thankla is asking, what about this business of repoliticizing democracies during peace? So democracies are what triggers repoliticization, presumably constructive repoliticization. So democracies are not just things sort of floating in the water that are sort of that always come back to the top and they go under. They're responsive to social and cultural conditions that change, sometimes irreversibly. The period of relative stability and tranquility that the West was in 2001, right, is never going to come back. You can't say, well, we don't know how it'll go. Maybe we'll be in a good moment like that again in 5 years. There are many social forces acting against that which you can't change. You can mitigate their impact, but you can't change them. So the idea of sort of constructively repoliticizing democracies is a pipe dream, but you can always do better. Now, I do believe in rallying calls to democratic values. I think they have limited use because it's not a moral or a motivational failing of us in the West that our democracies are getting wobbly. It's because of deeper factors. So we can't just motivate our way out of this, as it were. But I think it is good to encourage people to understand how precious democracy is, how catastrophic it is to lose it, what kind of a loss of sort of dignity it constitutes to not be a citizen in a democracy anymore and be stuck in an authoritarian regime. Of how much we take for granted we would lose, but all of that is really very limited. We have a major crisis of trust. I think it's the most significant crisis of trust in Europe since 1848. European revolutions of 1848. We can't just fix that crisis of trust, but there are many things we can do to repoliticize ourselves in a non-polarized, non-toxic way. That may entail certain economic policy. That may entail thinking about what could make the internet more democratic. and how to regulate the internet and who could regulate the internet. That might be to do with adding participatory elements to our democracies that make people feel that they can actually touch the political machine, as it were, so that they then believe it's kind of real and not necessarily in every way set against them. Um, so these things are important, but it's difficult. And we'll talk about why it's difficult and why it's important again on many occasions, I'm sure. Ace, Mr. Freeze, greetings. Greetings. 2 questions. What kind of US politician is needed in response to Russia's war? What kind of candidate can unite US Democrats after Biden? Thanks. I think the best thing that the United States can do is keep its democracy. And that's probably the best thing it can do for Ukraine too, anyway. And it's certainly possible that we could have a very difficult situation in 2024. A much more divided country, for example, compared to what we had in 2000, with you know a political crisis about the outcome of the election between Gore and Bush. If something like that replicates, and there is rabid dispute about who won, there's conversation about who is the president, whose side the military is on. All of that's possible, and Trump is an anti-democratic political actor, I'm sorry to say. Therefore, this is a precarious situation, and it would be a catastrophe for the West if US democracy went downhill badly, because certain distant democracies like Australia and New Zealand might persist, but European democracy is gonna tumble. If US democracy tumbles, European democracy will tumble. So the best thing Western countries can do is keep their democracies. Putin's strategy of winning the war is predicated on Western exhaustion, and the level of exhaustion that Putin needs is probably predicated on democratic collapse. There's plenty of other things we can say, but I think just for goodness sake, keep your democracies. That's already, in the medium term, a massive advantage for Ukraine. The second question, what kind of candidate can unite US Democrats after Biden, is very difficult. Because of the breakdown of trust, it's virtually impossible to produce a political candidate who will be at once powerfully electable, but also responsible. It's a very, very thin gap. It's a needle. And you're just not going to find realistically a political candidate who can get through that. Which means that with anybody who is elected, US democracy will little by little decline. One of the qualities you would need, if you did want to get through that needle, is you would need to be a populist and an institutionalist at once. You would need to be a populist who respects institutions, wants to honor institutions, wants to honor particularly counter-majoritarian institutions, right? There is a candidate that speaks the way you might speak at the kitchen table, but be reverential about democratic checks and balances, and be allergic to using democracy to weaken democracy. This is difficult. And I think there is a video possibility to take this conversation further, perhaps, in which we discuss what would be the 10 qualities a politician like that would need to have. Fascinatingly, they may need to be, they could not be center left on all issues or center-right on all issues. There would need to be a bit of both. And I mean, the other thing is that we're also experiencing another crisis, which is a crisis of sheer quality in politics. Um, Little by little, we're seeing a decline in the quality of national leaders, and that itself magnifies the trouble we face, right? I mean, whatever you think, for example, of the current British Prime Minister, when I watch him, he's roughly my age. What is my instinct? My instinct is to adopt him. I want to say, okay, Rishi, well done. You're doing your A levels. By the way, I've organized an internship for you. Now, I know you don't want an interesting internship. You're going to a law firm for your internship, little Rishi. So I should not feel like that about a leader of a country with a 60 million population. And yet, this isn't an accident. So um, that's not the main part of the story, but it's a top 10 part of the story, I think, whereby we are now having, if we use the British political sort of measuring rod, we're having national leaders come from a quality pool that 25 years ago would be appropriate to a junior cabinet minister, right? So, for example, I've just picked on conservative politician Rishi Sunak. Um, let's talk about the leader of the opposition, Keir Starmer, in the UK. Um, Now, people in my life have spent time with Keir, and I think he's got wonderful integrity. He's a very lovely man, but he's not. He's much more of a prime minister than Rishi Sunak, but he's not a prime minister. No, that's another. We've got a real problem of quality, right? So relative time works. Democratic politics seems to be at the mercy of rampant misinformation. I say distrust underneath the misinformation. Relative time works is asking how can we ever overcome this obstacle to reason by recognizing that it's not an obstacle to reason. It's a thirst for political agency. When a Trump voter says Trump won in 2020, and I don't want to face the suggestion that he didn't, um, when that claim is made, um, what happens is that challenging it is a kind of attack on that person's political agency, right? They can't find themselves politically in a world in which, you know, um, in a world in which you cannot challenge these institutions in the way they want to challenge them. So face the truth here means sort of political emaciation of people. You've got to recognize that and really understand that, and not go around telling people to wise up because they're fools. Um, so we've got to take seriously what lies underneath the misinformation. It's very rarely ignorance and irrationality. Um, and we'll be talking a lot about these pathologies of distrust that we suffer from. Stephen, and we're going to make this the last question, everybody. Um, what do you think the role of grandparents in history and self-interest plays in politics in any country? I see more than one question there, Stephen, so let me just make a couple of remarks. An excess of historical narratives behind policy is a sign that you don't have a functional modern state and you don't have a democracy. So, one of the telltale signs that something is extravagantly unhealthy in the Putin regime is not just that its historical narratives are so specially absurd or false, but that they're so um, necessary to justify regime's policy. That Putin needs to prance around and talk about what he thinks happened 150 years ago, 200 years ago, and that he's keen to go around, point at maps from different historical periods and point out what countries did or didn't exist then. That excess of reliance on historical narrative is a real problem. I think that the business of historical self-transparency is very important. And that's why we need a very healthy conversation about our historical inheritances, a truthful conversation, right? A conversation that should not whitewash ugly bits of our history, but also a conversation that does not simplify complexity, right? Um, so, for example, if you're talking about decolonizing the Anglo-American curriculum, I would say you've got to keep two things in mind about that. The fact that, firstly, it's a very necessary and vital thing to do. Um, and only if we do it well can we reckon with the ugliness of our imperial pasts. But that's just the one thing to keep in mind. The second thing to keep in mind is that much anti-colonial discourse today has become an unthinking crusade, irreconcilable with the complexity of historical truth, propelled by a pattern of hyper-identity politics that's actually here today but gone in 2035. So it's both. So we want to tie together social justice and truthfulness rather than untie them, or rather than work out what's true in terms of certain narratives of progress or certain narratives of identity politics. I think intergenerational conversations are very important in families. And this is the final point I'll make about this. And I think that the dissolution of the family unit um, is a very interesting political story, and it's part of the story of social and economic mobility that we're going to talk about separately, I'm sure. But it's an important question: what kind of loss occurs when families become more atomized and more dispersed across the country for economic reasons? And going back right to where we started, it's a question about Alistair McIntyre. Mike, thank you so much. There's a philosopher called Alistair McIntyre. He's still alive in his almost in his mid-90s, and he used to ask his students, "What is the role of an aunt?" So there's plenty to say about sort of the devolution of familial relationships. Tying that back to the ex-Soviet space, what's very significant is that a lot of the people who are diehard Putinists, including some who are in Eastern Europe, including some who are in the Baltics, are never going to be deconverted. they're just going to have to pass on as a generation. Um, and one of the fascinating things is that what Putin has within Russia temporarily achieved is for some of the folks in the middle, if we've got the young here and the old here and the folks in the middle, he's got the folks in the middle to side with the older folks, at least halfway. And that's not the most natural thing for them, actually, as Greg Uden argued the other day, quite persuasively. So when that generation goes, there is going to be change. That's enough rambling for now. Everybody, thank you so much for being with me. We've touched on a lot of things without properly following through, but I promise to come back, and everything about which we've been sort of elusive, my comments have been elusive, I want to elaborate on later. Lots of love, everybody. Morpai, thank you so much. Thank you for your wonderful recommendation. Ferrari guy, thank you. Jessica, thank you. Misha, thank you. Indy, thank you. Jacob, thank you. Everybody, thank you so much. Real pleasure to have been with you tonight.